Okay, so you know how it is. You're juggling like a million projects across different teams. And like half the people you work with are in like completely different time zones.
Yeah.
Your inbox is basically a war zone, but then like somehow the office rumor mill always seems to know. Like the latest scoop way before there's any kind of official announcement. It's like you can't escape it. It's just there.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of reminds me of this line from the book we're looking at today. If only formal communication could achieve half the success of gossip.
Ooh, that is spot on, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like,
That's so true.
and it kind of highlights this weird thing about work these days.
Yeah.
We've got all these communication tools, like we're drowning in Slack and email and all this stuff. But getting everyone on the same page still feels like this huge uphill battle.
It really does. And that's exactly why we wanted to do this deep dive today.
Right.
We went through all the material that you sent us.
Yeah.
Alan Barker's Improve Your Communication Skills.
Awesome book.
Right. To really try and cut through the noise and get to the heart of what effective communication is all about. Because it's not just about, pushing information out there. It's about making sure that people actually understand it.
Yeah, that shared understanding piece, so important. And I think Barker's book is really valuable here, especially when you think about how much the nature of like managing people has changed.
Mm-hmm.
It's less about top-down commands, and it's more about influencing people, collaborating with people. And that just puts a huge premium on how good our conversations are.
So in this deep dive, we're going to explore what communication really is, why some of those older ways of thinking about it just don't quite cut it anymore. And then, most importantly, we're going to look at a new way of understanding communication that puts shared understanding and the power of conversation front and center.
That's the goal.
Let's unpack this thing.
Let's do it.
Where do we even begin?
Well, Barker starts with the very basics, like the actual definition of communication.
Yeah.
And at its core, it's the transmission and reception of information.
Okay. Sounds pretty straightforward.
Seems like it.
Bit.
But there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Right. Because Barker makes this point that the word communication itself didn't always just refer to like information.
That's right.
Back in the 1800s. It also had this meaning of like the actual movement of things, like physical stuff and people.
Yeah. Like roads, railways, postal service.
Right.
All these things were considered part of communication.
That's interesting. I never thought about that. So it's like a whole different layer to the word.
Right. And I think that historical context is really important because if you think about it, it kind of shaped the metaphors that we still use today for how information travels.
Yeah.
So we talk about the flow of information, the channels, the networks. It's almost as if we're still thinking about ideas as these physical things being transported from one place to another.
I see. Yeah, like bits of data.
Exactly.
Storage, transfer, retrieval, and then all the new technologies that came along in the 20th century. We just kind of applied that same way of thinking, that industrial age thinking, to all of that.
Yeah. We talk about telephone lines, television channels, downloading data, uploading data. It's all very physical.
Right. Email, too, which is kind of funny when you think about it. It's still based on this idea of the postal service, like sending a letter.
It is. It's very much rooted in that sort of physical analogy.
Interesting. So it seems like this way of thinking, this industrial age, linear thinking, really influenced those early models of communication.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the most famous one is the Shannon-Weaver model.
Oh, yeah. I remember learning about that.
And it's interesting because it came out of Bell Telephone Labs, where their whole focus was on making telephone cables as efficient as possible.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that they would come up with this model.
Right. It was all about improving the technology. So how does it work? Just as a refresher.
Sure. So basically, they saw communication as this linear process with these distinct elements.
Okay.
So you have an information source, which creates a message. Then you have a transmitter, which converts that message into a signal.
Okay.
That signal travels through a channel.
Like the telephone wire.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then a receiver picks up that signal and converts it back into a message, which reaches the destination.
Oh, it's like sending a package.
Exactly. And they also considered noise, which is anything that interferes with the signal. Along the way...
That's static on a phone line.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And then, later on, they added the idea of feedback. which is the response from the receiver back to the sender.
Okay, so give me an example, like a real-world example of how this model works.
So let's stick with the phone call.
Okay.
The wire itself is the channel. The electrical current that carries the signal. It's the signal, obviously.
Right.
And then the handsets are the transmitter and receiver.
I see.
Any crackling or static you hear, that's the noise.
Yeah.
And then when you say hello or you get a dial tone, that's the feedback.
Okay, I'm with you. So how does this apply to a conversation like the one we're having right now?
Good question. Well, in this case, you and I are both the source and the receiver.
Taking turns.
Exactly. And the language we're using is how we encode and decode our thoughts. Any distractions around us would be the noise.
Right.
And then our facial expressions, our nods, our verbal responses, that's all feedback.
So it seems like a pretty neat self-contained system.
Right.
Like sending a package, you put something in a box, you put a label on it, you send it off.
And theoretically, arrives intact. At the other end...
Is that really how human communication works?
It's a good question. And it's one that Barker immediately raises.
Yeah.
Because if communication were this simple, why does it so often go wrong?
Yeah.
Especially in the workplace.
Right. I mean, we've all had those moments where we're like, wait, did I actually communicate what I meant to communicate? Or and I completely misunderstood what someone else was saying?
All the time. And I think that's where Otto Wio's laws of communication come in.
Oh, yeah. Those are great.
Those are those funny but very insightful observations about why communication in organizations often fails.
Give me some examples.
Sure. So one of them is communication usually fails, except by accident.
Right.
Another one is if communication can fail, it will fail.
Oh, yeah. That's a classic.
And then my personal favorite, if communication seems to succeed in the way you intend, someone's misunderstood.
Ooh, that one's a little mind-bending, but so true.
Right. And they're funny because they're often true, but they also point to the limitations of that simple transmission model.
Okay, so lay it on me. What are those limitations when we're talking about people communicating with each other?
Well, first of all, Barker makes this point that a message isn't the same thing as a physical object. It's not like a parcel. If you send a parcel, it's gone. But when you communicate an idea, you haven't lost anything. The original thought or information is still with you.
Yeah, that's a really good distinction. It's not like I'm giving you a piece of my brain.
Right. And I think that highlights the fact that something more complex is happening with a message than just its movement from one point to another.
Right. So it's not just about getting the words out there. There's something else going on.
And I think context is really crucial. So the same message delivered in different ways can have totally different impacts.
Yeah.
So if your boss tells you something face-to-face, it's going to have a completely different impact than if you get the same message in an email from a colleague.
Totally.
And even your own mood and mindset at the time will influence how you interpret the message.
Right. It's not just about the words themselves. It's about all the other stuff that surrounds them.
And I think the transmission model really misses that.
It does. It's like very one-sided. It's all about the sender sending the message. And it kind of assumes that the receiver is just passively absorbing it.
Exactly. Like a sponge.
Yeah.
And humans just don't work that way.
Not at all. We're not just empty vessels waiting to be filled with information.
Right. We're constantly processing, interpreting, making meaning. And I think that's a key difference. The transmission model focuses on information, but humans, we process meanings.
Yeah, that's huge. And it's not always straightforward. I mean, you could say something like, I'm fine, which on the surface seems like a very simple message. But depending on the context, the tone of voice, the relationship between the people, it could mean so many different things.
It could mean I'm actually fine.
Yeah.
It could mean I don't want to talk about it.
Right.
It could mean I'm actually not fine, but I want to tell you.
Right.
So there's all this subtext the transmission model doesn't really account for.
It doesn't. And it leads to what Barker calls the paradox of communication, which he gets from Patrick Bouvard. I love this quote. I can't expect you to understand everything I tell you, and I also can't expect you to understand only what I tell you.
I love that too.
Yeah.
It's so true. It basically says, look, there's always going to be some level of misunderstanding.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
It is, but it means that. We can't just assume that we're getting our message across.
We can't. We have to be more mindful of how we're communicating.
Yeah.
And we have to be aware of the fact that the receiver is also actively creating meaning.
Yeah. It's a two-way street.
Very much so.
Okay, so if that's the case, if it's not just about transmitting information, how do we make sense of things? What's going on in our brains when we're trying to understand something?
Well, Barker talks about this, and he says that understanding is fundamentally a process of pattern matching.
Okay.
So our brains are constantly taking in external stimuli, words, gestures, sounds, and they're trying to match those stimuli to pre-existing mental patterns that we have stored in our brains.
So we're always trying to make sense of new information based on what we already know.
Exactly. And that means that what we think we see or hear is heavily influenced by our own experiences, our beliefs, our expectations.
That makes sense. It's like we're always looking for connection.
Right. And our brains are amazing at making those connections.
We are. I mean, billions of neurons all firing and connecting. It's incredible.
Yeah. And they can do so many things.
At the same time.
Like a supercomputer.
Right. And that parallel processing is what allows us to interact with the world in such a dynamic way.
How does that work with communication?
Well, Barker talks about two types of processing that are constantly happening in our brains. Bottom-up processing and top-down processing. Oh, yeah, I've heard of those. Yeah. So bottom-up processing is where our brains start by noticing those basic sensory details, shapes, colors, sounds, and that happens in the lower levels of the brain.
And then those individual pieces of information get sent up to the higher levels, the neocortex.
And that's where top-down processing comes in.
Exactly. So top-down processing is where the neocortex provides the mental frameworks, the patterns, the expectations that help us organize all that incoming sensory information.
So bottom-up is like taking in the raw data, and top-down is like making sense of it.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure. So imagine you're reading a book.
Okay.
Bottom-up processing is recognizing the shapes of the letters.
Right.
Top-down processing is combining those letters into words and then those words into sentences.
I see. So they're working together.
All the time. It's this constant feedback loop where the brain is updating its internal models based on new information.
Right. And because we don't always have all the information, our brains have to make these educated guesses about what's going on.
Exactly. So think about trying to hear a single conversation in a crowded room.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one.
Your brain has to filter out all the other noise and focus on the specific sounds that are relevant to the conversation you're trying to follow.
Right, and sometimes it gets it wrong.
It does, and that's where perceptual completion comes in.
Yeah, okay, what's that?
So perceptual completion is our brain's ability to fill in the missing pieces based on the patterns. That it already knows.
Okay.
So a classic example of this is the Knissa triangle illusion.
Yeah, I've seen that. It's like you see a triangle, but it's not actually there.
Right. There are 3 Pac-Man shapes arranged in a certain way. And your brain automatically sees a triangle, even though there are no lines actually forming the triangle.
Yeah, it's crazy. But it shows how powerful our brains are at creating meaning. And the information is incomplete.
Exactly. So what this all means for communication is that we can't just assume that the other person is seeing or hearing the same thing that we are. They're bringing their own experiences, their own biases to the table.
We all have those filters.
We do. And we need to be aware of that when we're communicating.
Okay. So how does this new understanding of how our brains work, how does it change the way we should think about communication itself?
Well, it moves us away from that simple transmission model where it's just about sending the message. And it forces us to think about the impact of our communication.
The effect that it has on the other person.
Exactly. So instead of just asking, what information am I sending?
Right.
We need to be asking, what effect am I likely to have?
I like that. It's a more holistic approach.
It is. And it also means that we need to be more aware of the context in which communication is happening.
Right.
Because context is everything.
It is.
And Barker identifies at least 5 key contexts that are always at play.
Lay them on me.
So the first one is psychological.
Okay.
Which is basically the individual needs, the beliefs, the past experiences that each person brings to the interaction.
Right. We all have our own baggage.
We do.
Yeah.
And then relational context.
Yeah. So That's about the relationship between the people.
Exactly. So the power dynamics,
Hmm.
the level of trust,
Mm.
the history between them, all of that influences how the communication is received.
Right.
And then there's situational context.
The immediate environment.
Precisely. So where the conversation is taking place, what's going on around them,
Right.
all of that can have an impact. And then there's environmental context.
Okay. So that's like the bigger picture.
Right. So the general atmosphere, current events, things like that.
I see.
And then finally, there's cultural context.
Which is all about shared norms, values,
Yeah.
assumptions.
Yeah. So the culture of the organization, the culture of the society, all of that plays a role.
It does. So it's really this complex interplay of all these different factors.
It is. And it
Work
means
factors.
that we can never fully control how our message is received.
Because we can't control all those different contexts.
Right. And that brings us to that famous quote
Mm.
from Paul Watzlawick.
Oh, yeah. Hit me with it.
One cannot not communicate.
Ooh.
It is. And what it means is that even when we're silent, even when we're not actively doing anything,
Yeah.
we're still communicating.
Our body language is still sending signals.
Our presence
Yeah.
or absence is communicating something.
Right. So
But
there's no escaping it.
there isn't. Which means that we might as well be intentional about it.
So in this new model, in this more nuanced model, what does it mean to communicate effectively?
Well, it's not just about ensuring
Mm.
that the message is transmitted intact.
Right.
It's about increasing the area of shared understanding.
So that's the overlap
I mean,
between our mental models.
precisely. And I think Barker reminds us that the word communication itself comes from the Latin word communis, which means common or shared.
Oh, I see. So it's baked into the word.
It is. So communication at its core is about trying to create that shared meaning to align our understanding.
It's a process.
Very much so. And it happens on multiple levels.
Like those different contexts.
Exactly. So you have
Sure.
the environmental context, the situational context,
Right.
and then underpinning both of those,
Yeah.
you have the relational context.
And what about our individual psychology?
There's the foundation.
The bedrock.
Yeah. It influences how we navigate all those other levels.
So we're all bringing our own unique perspectives.
Always.
Okay. So we've talked about the limitations of the transmission model, and we've talked about this new way of understanding communication as a process of
Right.
creating shared understanding. But how does this all play out in the workplace?
Well, I think one of the key insights from Barker's book
yeah.
is that as managers, we often assume that the primary goal
Yeah.
of communication is to drive action.
To get things done.
Yeah. But Barker points out that as individuals, we communicate for a whole range of other reasons.
Like what?
Well, we communicate
Yeah.
to build relationships,
Yeah.
to maintain relationships, to share information for its own sake.
Right. Just to connect with people.
And I think that's where a lot of organizational communication falls short.
Because it's too focused on the task at hand.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
all about efficiency, productivity,
Right.
but it forgets about the human element.
Yeah. The need to connect, the need to share.
And I think that's a big part of why people feel so disconnected
Yeah.
in the workplace.
It is. So if we want to improve our communication, we need to think about more than just getting things done.
We need to think about building relationships,
Yeah.
creating a sense of community.
And that all starts with conversation.
It does. And Barker argues that conversation is the primary tool that we have for building relationships, sharing information, and advancing our ideas.
It's the foundation.
It is. And he even goes so far
Yeah.
as to say that organizations are essentially networks of conversations.
I like that because it's true. I mean, think about all the meetings, the presentations, the emails, the phone calls.
Right.
It's all conversation in one form or another.
It is. And so if we want to become better communicators,
Yeah.
we need to start by improving the quality of our
Yeah.
conversation.
Because that's where it all begins.
It is. And I think that's something that
Yeah.
we often take for granted.
We do. We just assume that we know how to have a conversation.
Right. But it's actually a skill,
It is a skill
Yeah.
that we can learn and improve.
and one that we
Yeah.
need to be more mindful of, especially in the workplace.
How do we do that?
Yeah.
How do we improve the quality
You-
of our conversations?
Well, Barker defines conversation as a dynamic of talking and listening.
Okay.
And he emphasizes that, the quality of that dynamic.
Yeah.
Depends more on the listening than the talking.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about being a good talker.
It's not. It's about being a good listener.
And I think that's where a lot of us struggle.
I agree. And Peter Senge has
Yeah.
these great concepts of advocacy and inquiry.
Fill me in.
So advocacy is about clearly stating your own perspective, your own ideas.
Okay.
And inquiry is about actively listening to the other person and trying to understand their viewpoint.
It's about finding that balance
Yeah.
between advocating for your own ideas and being open to the ideas of others.
Exactly. And Senge argues that the most effective conversations involve a healthy balance of both.
Right. Because if it's all advocacy and no inquiry,
Right.
it just becomes an argument.
It does. And no one really listens to each other.
Right. And if it's all inquiry and no advocacy,
Then it can feel aimless, like it's not going anywhere.
right. So you need both. You need to be able to stand up for your own ideas,
Mhm.
but you also need to be able to truly listen to the ideas of others.
Exactly. And there are a lot of things that
Yeah.
can get in the way
Mm.
of having those kinds of conversations.
Like what?
Well, sometimes we just don't have enough time.
Right. Everyone's busy.
We might be trying to have
Yeah.
the conversation at the wrong time or in the wrong place.
Yeah. If you're trying to have serious conversation in the middle of a busy hallway,
Not going to work.
not ideal.
There might be a lack of privacy.
Yeah. If you're worried about people overhearing,
There might just be a general sense of discomfort.
if the relationship isn't quite there yet.
And then, of
Yeah.
course,
Yeah.
there are always distractions.
Oh, yeah. Phones, emails, the internet.
It's hard to focus
Yeah,
with all that going on.
it is. So we need to be mindful of all those factors when we're trying to have a meaningful conversation.
We do. And we also need to be aware of our own mental models.
Oh, yeah. Those are the deeply ingrained assumptions and beliefs that we all have
Yeah.
about how the world works.
Right. And they can really shape our conversations without us even realizing it.
Because they influence how we interpret information, how we respond to people.
And if we're not aware of them, they can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings.
So it's important to take a step back and think about what our own assumptions are.
It is. And to be open to the possibility that other people might have different assumptions.
Right, and that's okay.
It is. And then there's the issue of status.
Which is always there, lurking in the background.
It is. And it can subtly influence how we interact with each other.
So we might be more likely to defer to someone who we perceive as having higher status.
Right. Or we might be more likely to interrupt someone who we perceive as having lower status.
And Barker also talks about Belbin's team roles.
yeah, those are those different roles
Yeah.
that people play in teams.
Like the thinker, the doer, the coordinator.
And Barker's point is that
Yeah.
we shouldn't let those roles limit our conversations.
Right. We should see people as more than just their
Yeah.
job title.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different factors that can affect the quality of our conversations. But
Right.
what about the structure of a conversation?
Okay.
Is there a way to think about how a conversation should flow?
Well, Barker talks about this, and he says that our thinking process
Mhm.
generally unfolds in two stages.
Yeah.
First stage thinking and second stage thinking.
Break it down for me.
So first stage thinking is about perception. It's about accurately observing what's happening and naming it.
Okay.
Second stage thinking is about judgment. It's about evaluating
Yeah.
the information and deciding what to do.
So first stage is like gathering the data, and second stage is like analyzing it.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And Barker argues that our conversations tend to mirror this two-stage process.
How so?
We can't really have a meaningful discussion about something
Mhm.
until we've first agreed on what it is.
Right. If we're not even on the same page
Yeah,
about what we're talking about.
exactly. And so the way we define or name
Yeah.
a situation can really influence the entire conversation.
So if we start off by framing the problem in a certain way,
Yeah.
that's going to shape how we think about it and how we talk about it.
And Barker says that
Yeah.
we're often really good at second stage thinking,
We're good at analyzing, debating, coming up with solutions.
but we have a tendency to rush through that first stage
Mm-hmm.
of clearly defining the situation.
We jump to conclusions.
We do. We label things, we make assumptions without really taking the time to consider all the different perspectives.
And that can lead to all sorts of problems.
It can. Because if we're not starting from a place of shared understanding, it's going to be really hard to have a productive conversation.
So we need to slow down and pay attention.
To that first stage.
We do. We need to be deliberate about how we're understanding and defining the situation.
Before we jump to solutions.
Before we start arguing.
Before we even start talking.
Sometimes.
That's good advice. So what else does Barker have to say about conversations?
Well, he talks about nonverbal communication.
Oh, yeah. That's huge.
It is. And it's something that we often don't even think about.
But it's so important.
It is, because our body language, our tone of voice, all of that is communicating just as much as our words are.
Right. So we need to be aware of the signals that we're sending.
We do. And we need to make sure that our nonverbal communication is aligned with our verbal communication.
Right. So if we're saying one thing, but our body language is saying something else.
People are going to pick up on that.
They are. And it's going to create confusion and distrust.
Exactly. So alignment is key.
Okay. Anything else? Yeah. So Barker also talks about different types of conversations.
Oh, interesting. So there's more than one.
There is. And he identifies 4 main types.
I'm all ears.
So the first type is what he calls a relationship-focused conversation.
Okay.
Or a welcome conversation.
So this is all about building rapport.
Exactly. Making connections.
Right.
The second type is a possibility conversation.
Okay.
Or an acquire conversation.